The highway stretched endlessly before her, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt blending with the steady drumming of rain against her windshield. Danielle Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as she inhaled a slow, measured breath. Today should have been a day of triumph, a day to celebrate. Instead, she felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, an invisible burden she had carried for years. She had fought for this moment. 20 years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks despite the unspoken obstacles. The looks, the subtle exclusions in the break rooms. The way her ideas had been brushed aside only for a male colleague to suggest the same thing moments later, and receive praise. But she had persisted, refusing to be diminished, refusing to be pushed aside. Now, she had finally arrived, the first black woman appointed as chief of police in this city's long, complicated history. But she was under no illusions. This city, Fairhaven, had a reputation. Conservative, resistant to change, deeply entrenched in its ways. It wasn't just the officers in her new department who had made their dissatisfaction. Known city officials, local businesses, even some members of the community had voiced their disapproval in not so subtle ways. They didn't want her here. They didn't believe someone like her could lead. And that was exactly why she had to. The GPS announced her turn was half a mile ahead, and as she flicked on her signal, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. A patrol car was pulling up fast behind her, the siren wailing for only a second before cutting off. Danielle's stomach tightened. She knew what was about to happen. She had seen it play out too many times before, just never to herself. She pulled over, her pulse steady, her breath even. She had prepared for battles inside that precinct. She hadn't expected to fight one before even setting foot inside. Danielle Carter eased her black SUV onto the narrow shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. The flashing red and blue lights pulsed behind her, reflecting off her rearview mirror like an ominous warning. She exhaled slowly, unclenching her jaw. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the pattern. She had committed no traffic violation, no speeding, no broken taillight, no expired registration. This wasn't about the law. This was about who they thought she was. In the mirror, she watched as two officers stepped out of their patrol car. One was an older, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, Sergeant Robert Evans, by the look of the nameplate on his uniform. The other, younger, probably in his late 20s, moved with an eagerness that suggested he was still proving himself. Officer Jake Miller. Danielle took another deep breath, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. She knew how quickly these encounters could turn. Evans approached first, stopping just short of her driver's side window. He didn't immediately speak. Instead, he assessed her eyes dragging over her face, her posture, the polished black blazer she wore over a crisp button-down. She could see it, the calculation in his eyes. Miller, meanwhile, took position slightly behind, one hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered firearm. A message. Danielle knew the routine. License and registration. His voice was clipped, authoritative. She nodded, moving slowly as she retrieved the documents from her glove compartment, then handed them over without a word. Evans barely glanced at them before exchanging a quick look with Miller. "Where you headed?" Evans asked. "To work," Danielle replied, keeping her tone even. Miller leaned in slightly. "What kind of work?" She turned her gaze to him, measuring him. His expression wasn't outright hostile, just suspicious. "I'm in law enforcement," she said simply. Evans let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "That so?" His voice carried a hint of condescension, as if the very idea amused him. "Which department?" Danielle didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them. She had learned a long time ago that silence was often more powerful than words. Evans shifted his weight, his smirk faltering just a little. Miller, on the other hand, wasn't done. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "this area isn't always safe for outsiders." Danielle felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't react. That was the game, wasn't it? They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to flinch, to make a mistake. She wouldn't give them that. Instead, she tilted her head, mirroring Miller's posture. "Is that so?" she said coolly. Evans cleared his throat, stepping in. "We could bring you in for questioning." Danielle finally let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. "On what charge?" Evans hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was everything. He had nothing. Miller shifted, clearly picking up on the change in tone. Just a routine stop, he muttered, but his confidence had slipped. Danielle exhaled. Her patience was wearing thin. They were dragging this out because they could. Because they thought they held the power in this situation. She turned slightly in her seat, looking Evans directly in the eye. "Tell me something, Sergeant," she said, her voice level but firm. "How many routine stops last this long?" Neither of them answered. Danielle nodded slowly. "Time to end this." She reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out a single piece of identification, her official department badge. And then, with absolute calm, she spoke. "That's enough." She met Evan's gaze, unwavering. "I'm Chief Danielle Carter, your new boss." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, neither officer moved. "Sergeant." Robert Evans' face lost its smirk, his confidence evaporating in an instant. His eyes flicked between the badge in Danielle's hand and the unwavering expression on her face. Officer Jake Miller, standing just behind him, looked like a man watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. Danielle didn't flinch. She had learned, over the years, how to recognize the precise moment when a man realized he had miscalculated. This was that moment. Evans opened his mouth, then closed it. He took a half step back, as if creating distance would somehow lessen the weight of what had just happened. He had just unlawfully detained his own superior. Miller, still young enough to be ruled by instinct rather than experience, tried to regain control of the situation. This must be a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice lacking the certainty it had carried just minutes ago. "We were just doing our job." Danielle let out a quiet breath through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. She could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but she had no intention of letting it dictate her next move. She tucked her badge away and folded her hands in her lap, regarding them both with the same level, unreadable gaze she had perfected in an interrogation room. "A misunderstanding," she echoed, her voice even. "Tell me, Officer Miller, what, exactly, did you misunderstand?" Miller hesitated. His mouth opened, but no words came. Evans recovered first, though his voice lacked the earlier arrogance. "We stop suspicious vehicles in this area all the time," he said. "It's standard procedure." Danielle tilted her head slightly, her patience thinning by the second. "Suspicious," she repeated. "Would you like to tell me what, exactly, about me or my vehicle was suspicious?" Another pause. Evans' jaw tightened. "Just being cautious," he muttered. Danielle let the words hang in the air between them. Being cautious. That was always the excuse, wasn't it? The justification. The reason men like Evans got away with profiling people who looked like her, stopping them, questioning them, treating them as if existing in the wrong place was a crime. She had read too many reports about cases like this. But this time, she wasn't reading it. She was living it. Danielle exhaled through her nose, her fingers drumming lightly against her knee. "Tell me something, Sergeant," she said, her tone calm but firm. "If I were a white man in a suit, driving this same car, would you have pulled me over?" Evans' mouth tightened. "That's not, yes or no." His silence was all the answer she needed. Miller, younger and less practiced at hiding his discomfort, looked away. Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make them listen. "This department has a problem," she said. "And whether you realize it or not, you've just proven exactly what that problem is." Evans' eyes darted toward Miller, as if searching for backup. But the younger officer was visibly shaken now, his earlier confidence eroded. Danielle had seen this before, the slow realization, the uncomfortable shift when someone recognized that they were the ones on trial now. She let another beat of silence pass before speaking again. "I could write you up for this," she said. "I could call a disciplinary hearing before I even set foot in my office. And believe me, I have every right to do that." Evans stiffened. Miller swallowed hard. "But I won't," Danielle continued. "Not yet." They blinked. Confusion flickered across their faces. "Because right now, I want to see what kind of men I'm dealing with," she said. "Are you the kind that's going to dig in, make excuses, and pretend this never happened? Or are you the kind that's going to recognize a mistake and make damn sure it doesn't happen again?" Neither man spoke. Danielle didn't break eye contact. "Make no mistake, gentlemen," she said. "This department is about to change. And then, without waiting for a response, she put her hands back on the wheel. "Am I free to go?" Evans visibly swallowed his pride. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered. Danielle nodded once. And as she pulled back onto the road, she didn't need to look in the mirror to know they were still standing there, watching her go, realizing too late that their world had just shifted. Danielle Carter didn't glance in the rearview mirror as she pulled back onto the road. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she had left behind: two officers, standing stiffly on the side of the road, grappling with the weight of their mistake. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she navigated through the streets of Fairhaven, she could feel the tension thick in the air, like an oncoming storm. She had arrived in this city fully expecting resistance, but she had thought she would at least make it through the front doors of the precinct before the battle began. Apparently, the fight had come to her first. When she finally pulled into the parking lot of the Fairhaven Police Department, she allowed herself a moment, just one, to breathe, to push down the frustration still simmering in her chest. She wasn't here to start fights. She was here to change things. She stepped out of the car, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and walked through the front entrance, where silence immediately fell over the room. The station was busy, officers moving between desks, phones ringing, conversations murmuring under the hum of fluorescent lights. But as soon as Danielle walked in, everything stopped. Some of them recognized her. Others had only heard about her. But they all knew who she was. The new chief of police. She could see it in their faces. Some were surprised, some were wary, and a few, the bold ones, didn't bother to hide their displeasure. Danielle wasn't fazed. She walked toward the administrative office, where a secretary, an older woman with graying hair, glanced up from her computer. "I'm here for my first meeting," Danielle said, her tone professional but firm. Before the secretary could respond, the door to the conference room swung open, and standing there, his face still slightly pale from their roadside encounter, was Sergeant Robert Evans. Their eyes locked. For a split second, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his posture. "Chief Carter," he said, forcing out the words. "Didn't realize you'd arrived." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I imagine you didn't." Evans hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape. The other officers were watching now, picking up on the tension. Danielle wasn't about to let this moment slip away. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear her. "Tell me something, Sergeant," she said. "How many people have you pulled over like that? People who don't have a badge to protect them?" Evans swallowed hard. Danielle gave him a moment to respond, but when he didn't, she nodded to herself. That was answer enough. Then, without another word, she brushed past him into the conference room, where her first official meeting as chief of police was about to begin. And for the first time, the department understood things were about to change. Danielle Carter stepped into the conference room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm. The long table at the center of the room was surrounded by officers, detectives, and senior staff, most of whom were already watching her with a mix of skepticism and forced neutrality. She could feel it, the weight of unspoken resentment, the quiet defiance in some of their postures, the tension crackling just beneath the surface. They had been waiting for her, not to welcome her, to test her, and she was ready. Danielle moved toward the head of the table, her expression unreadable. As she placed her hands on the back of the chair, she let her gaze sweep the room, making sure to meet every single pair of eyes. Some looked away, others stiffened. She noted both reactions. Then, the door creaked open behind her, and Sergeant Robert Evans stepped inside. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, but Danielle caught it. A flicker of recognition, a shared glance between officers. They knew, they had heard what happened. Danielle didn't acknowledge him immediately. Instead, she slowly pulled out the chair and took a seat. Her seat. Only then did she lift her eyes back to Evans. "Sergeant," she said, her voice even. "Take a seat." Evans hesitated. There was no smirk this time. No false bravado. Just hesitation. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the situation. After a long pause, he moved toward an empty chair near the middle of the table. He didn't sit at the front, he didn't sit near her. He sat lower in the hierarchy than he ever had before. Danielle let the silence stretch, Let them all feel the shift in the air. Then, she leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together. I want to be very clear about something, she said, her voice calm, but firm. This department is not the same department it was yesterday. A murmur of movement. A few glances exchanged. Danielle continued. I didn't come here to play politics. I didn't come here to make friends. And I sure as hell didn't come here to maintain the status quo. The weight of her words settled over the room. Some of you are already questioning why I'm here, she said, scanning their faces. You don't have to say it out loud. I can see it. I can feel it. You think I don't belong here. You think you can wait me out. She let the silence punctuate her words. You're wrong. Still, no one spoke. Danielle let her gaze linger on Evans, watching as his jaw tightened just slightly. Before I even set foot in this building, I was given a first-hand introduction to how this department operates. Her voice didn't rise, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Some of you already know what I'm talking about. Evans stilled. Danielle leaned back, exhaling slowly. There are two types of officers in this room. The ones who recognize that this department needs to change, and the ones who are too damn stubborn to admit it. She tapped her fingers against the table, slow and methodical. This city is watching us, she continued. The press is watching us. The community is watching us. And starting today, I will be watching all of you. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Danielle nodded to herself. Good. Let them squirm. She turned her attention back to Evans. Sergeant, for the next 30 days, I want a detailed report of every single traffic stop conducted by this department. Who was stopped? Why they were stopped? How long they were detained? Evans clenched his jaw. Chief, I wasn't finished. His mouth snapped shut. Danielle held his gaze. If I see even a hint of bias, we will have a conversation. If it happens again, we will have a disciplinary hearing. If it continues beyond that, you won't be sitting at this table anymore. Silence. Then, finally Evans gave a tight nod. Understood. Danielle studied him for a long moment, then turned her attention back to the room. You all have a choice, she said, standing. Adapt, or find another department. Because this one, it's going to be better. And with that, the balance of power shifted. Danielle Carter didn't waste time. The moment the meeting ended, she walked straight to her office, shutting the door behind her. No hesitation. No doubt. No fear. She had faced officers like Evans before, men who thrived in the comfort of unchecked authority. Men who believed the badge gave them power, rather than responsibility. But that era was over. Danielle sat at her desk and pulled out a legal pad. She didn't need to wait for Evans's report. She already knew the problem ran deep. Now, she had to decide how to root it out. Her first directive had been clear: every traffic stop, every detention, every routine encounter would be documented and reviewed. That was just the beginning. She reached for the phone and dialed. Jessica, can you get me all past misconduct reports from the last 5 years? The woman on the other end, her new assistant, paused before answering. Chief, we don't usually have those readily available. They go through internal review. Danielle's jaw tightened. There it was. Then I suggest we start making them available, she said. I want everything on my desk by the end of the day. She hung up before she could get an excuse. Then, she made the next call. Captain Reynolds, she said when he answered. I want to implement body cams for all patrol officers, effective immediately. Another pause. That's going to take some time, Chief. No, it won't, Danielle said. The funding has been sitting in the budget for 2 years. I already checked. The order was never approved because it wasn't a priority. Well, it is now. A longer silence. Then, finally, understood. Danielle exhaled. Progress. But it wasn't enough. She knew how systems like this worked. They didn't just resist change, they fought it. Some of the officers in this department would fall in line. Others would resist. And some, like Evans, would be watching for the first sign of weakness. She wouldn't give them one. Her intercom buzzed. Chief, Jessica's voice came through. There are a few officers outside your office. They said they need to speak with you. Danielle leaned back in her chair. It was starting already. Send them in. The door opened, and 3 officers stepped inside: Detective Paul Lawson, Officer Maria Lopez, and Officer Greg Marshall. She studied them carefully. Lawson was mid-50s, a veteran. Lopez was in her late 30s, a steady presence in the department. Marshall. Younger, eager. They closed the door behind them. Lawson spoke first. "Chief," he said, clearing his throat. "We just wanted to say, we heard what happened this morning." Danielle didn't react. "And?" Lawson hesitated, then sighed. "Look, not everyone here is like Evans." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "That's good to hear, but I don't care about not everyone. I care about accountability." Lopez nodded. "That's why we're here." Danielle leaned forward slightly. "We've been trying to push for reforms in this department for years," Lopez continued. "Mandatory bias training, updated protocols, body cams. But every time we brought it up, it got buried." Danielle's lips pressed together. "Buried by men like Evans." "We're with you," Marshall said, his voice firm. "Whatever you need, we'll back you up." Danielle studied them. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Good," she said. "Because I'm just getting started." And with that, the reform truly began. Danielle Carter stood at the front of the packed conference room, the weight of the last few weeks settling over her. The department had resisted her, fought her, and in some cases, outright ignored her directives. But they had also learned something: she wasn't going anywhere. The changes had started to take effect. Mandatory body cams were finally being implemented. Officers were now required to log every traffic stop, every detention, every questionable encounter. Complaints that had once been brushed aside were now being reviewed with scrutiny. The old ways were cracking. Not everyone was happy about it. Some officers had pushed back. Others had resigned. Evans had remained resentful but careful, keeping his head down, watching, waiting for her to slip up. She wouldn't. Today, she was standing before the entire department for the first time since her appointment, and they all knew why. The press had gotten wind of what happened the day she arrived. The story had spread. A new police chief, a black woman, pulled over and questioned by her own officers. Some called it poetic justice. Others called it a scandal. Danielle? She called it a wake-up call. She let the silence stretch, let the officers feel the weight of the moment. No podium. No notes. Just her and them. Then, finally, she spoke. "Let's be honest," she said, her voice calm but firm. "A lot of you don't want me here." A ripple of unease passed through the room. A few glances were exchanged. Some officers stared straight ahead, refusing to react. "That's fine," she continued. "I don't need you to like me. I don't need you to agree with me. But you will respect this department, and you will respect the people we serve." A heavy silence. "Because this department is changing," she said, her tone sharper now. "And you have two choices: be part of that change, or get out of the way." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others straightened in their seats, chins lifting just slightly. Danielle took a slow breath, then softened her tone. "I know change is hard," she said. "I know a lot of you feel like I'm here to tear down everything you've built. I'm not. I'm here to make it better. For you. For the community. For everyone." She let that settle. "I've spent my career fighting for a badge I had to earn twice as hard as some of the men in this room," she continued. "And I still believe in what that badge stands for. But belief isn't enough. We have to prove it. Every single day." She glanced across the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. "There's a reason people don't trust us," she said. "And it's our job to fix that. Not by words. Not by press conferences. By action." The room remained silent, but it wasn't resistance anymore. It was something else. Something closer to understanding. Danielle nodded. "We will be better," she said. "Not because we have to. Because we should." Then, with deliberate finality, she stepped away from the front of the room. The meeting was over, but the work was just beginning. As she walked toward her office, she felt a presence fall into step beside her. It was Officer Maria Lopez. "You meant every word of that," Lopez said. "It wasn't a question." Danielle glanced at her. "I don't say things I don't mean." Lopez smiled slightly. "Good," she said. "Because some of us have been waiting for this." Danielle paused at her office door. She looked back at the department, the officers dispersing. The shift in energy, the weight of a system that had begun, just barely, to move. She wasn't naive. She knew there would be more fights ahead. More resistance. More obstacles. But she also knew something else. This was only the beginning. And for the first time, in a long time, change didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges deeply ingrained systems. Danielle Carter's journey reminds us that true leadership isn't about seeking approval, but about standing firm in the face of resistance. She didn't come to maintain the status quo. She came to make things better, even when it meant pushing against forces that wanted her to fail. Her story teaches us an important lesson. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without conflict. But when we stand by our values, when we lead with integrity and demand accountability, transformation becomes inevitable. For many older Americans, this story may feel familiar. How many times in life have we seen injustice, experienced resistance, or been told that things will never change? Yet history shows us that the world shifts when people refuse to back down. Danielle's strength is a reminder that the fight for fairness, respect, and dignity is lifelong, but it's always worth it. Whether in our communities, workplaces, or even within our own families, we all have the power to influence positive change. We just have to be willing to stand up and demand it. Danielle Carter's story isn't just about one woman's fight. It's about the power of perseverance, accountability, and the courage to demand change. True leadership is tested in moments of resistance, and real progress begins when we refuse to accept the status quo. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to join us in sharing powerful stories of justice, resilience, and transformation.